Well, this settles it all, ladies and gentlemen. That is a one cold swan outside the Swan Terrace, sitting in the snow, wondering what in the world is going on. Yeah. They're trying to get some heat. Well, first that powerful snowstorm came along the East Coast, and now a brutal blast of extremely cold temperatures. Wind chills approaching 50 below zero in New England.
And that cold weather is going to make it even harder for people to dig out after the storm, excuse me, dropped as much as 1.5 feet of snow in some areas. Mark Martin has the story.
In addition to heavy snow and hurricane-force winds, the winter storm caused massive flooding. High water overtook a seawall south of Boston. Many say it's the most powerful storm surge in decades.
I was shocked at how quickly the water rose.
Rescuers helped more than a dozen people when water encircled their homes. Rafts weren't the only way to safety. You can see here a Good Samaritan uses a front-end loader to rescue a woman from the second story of her house.
This is the biggest one since I was a kid in 1978.
The winter weather caused the Hudson River to freeze in New York City. The Coast Guard used a cutter to break up the ice. The winter storm also led to major issues at airports, causing delays and cancellations.
Well, we had a flight back to New York, and now it's canceled, so we're stuck here another day.
On the ground, the storm turned deadly. Authorities say at least 7 people lost their lives in weather-related accidents.
And blizzard conditions even hit in the Virginia Beach area. The snow piled quickly in the strong winds, a far cry from what you picture when you think of the tourist destination.
CBN's Operation Blessing helped clear driveways and streets.
My husband needs a revision on his hip replacement, and the snowstorm came. So we couldn't get help from anywhere else, and we called the local fire department, and they referred us to Operation Blessing.
And we've had local volunteers come out and help us help these precious residents begin to dig out.
Mark Martin, CBN News.
Well, here's what Operation Blessing is doing locally. We've got something we call snow buddies. They need volunteers to help shovel snow in our Norfolk, Virginia Beach and Chesapeake area. And so if you want to help, you can be a snow buddy, somebody who really needs help to get out of their house. One such person was Gordon, who was supposed to be sitting in this chair today. He called and said, I can't get out of my house. There's so much snow.
You know, the wind was so bad here that for many people, I know the snow actually blew up against their doors. So literally, they couldn't get out.
Yeah, well, that's one of our makeup ladies. Her husband couldn't get out of the house. We've got some of the crew staying at the Founders Inn because they can't, there's no way of traveling. And one caregiver told me today that the Interstate 64, which is a major artery, was at least one of the lanes, there's a 4-lane, a couple of the lanes were blocked off.
I believe it. Well, everything's been packed down here now. You know, it didn't get moved right away, so we're driving on snow, not knowing whether there's ice underneath it, and we don't do that here.
Well, the problem is, come Sunday and Monday, if this thing melts a little bit and then freezes, it's going to be a beast. And so, again, we warn people, if you've got to travel someplace, please be careful. And you can't see that black ice that's in there. I mean, you never know for sure when something is you're going to hit a spot where you have no control over your car at all. You start going at the normal 70 miles an hour or whatever the speed limit is, 65 or whatever, and you have no control. So we don't want you to be hurt. Well, there's some more good news on the economy. The Dow, as you know, closed above 25,000 for the first time in history. That was yesterday. John Jessup has that good news.
Well, Pat, under President Trump, the American economy is outperforming expectations. Experts say the president's policies have helped improve the economy. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Washington are scrambling to tackle several major issues to avoid a government shutdown later this month. Jennifer Wishon brings us that story.
Cheers as the Dow Jones made history Thursday, busting through the 25,000 mark. That follows a big 25% gain in 2017. President Trump told reporters 30,000 must be the new number to reach for. Some experts credit the president's cuts and regulations for giving businesses a big boost. And the president tweets more cuts are on the way. He also credits the historic tax cuts he signed into law before Christmas.
More than 60 companies have announced they are raising wages, including many that have voluntarily raised their minimum wage to $15 per hour. And I mean, they did that voluntarily, which many politicians said could only be achieved by government mandate.
But as the private sector soars, leaders here in Washington are trying to work out the government's finances. Disagreements among Democrats and Republicans over spending priorities and what to do about young undocumented immigrants threaten another government shutdown.
Our position has been clear.
The president called Republican leaders to the White House to discuss DACA. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that Trump is ending. He's given lawmakers until March to come up with a solution, but Democrats say they won't go along with a budget deal unless the so-called Dreamers are guaranteed protections. And Republicans need votes from Democrats to pass a spending plan.
Any legislation on DACA must secure the border with a wall. It must give our immigration officers the resources they need to stop illegal immigration and also to stop visa overstays. And crucially, the legislation must end chain migration.
The president is calling a bipartisan meeting next week to try to find a solution.
What we're talking about is the restoration of the two great pillars of American immigration policy. One is a belief that legal immigration is good, but that respect for the rule of law was equally important.
Democrats are also demanding non-defense government programs get increases in spending equal to those Republicans are proposing for the Pentagon.
Nobody wants to shut the government down on either side, and I'm optimistic we'll get a resolution to many of those issues before January 19th.
Despite disagreements here in Washington, the good news for Americans is the economy appears to be getting stronger and has a rosy forecast.
These great results are just the beginning. When the dreams of the American people are unleashed, there is nothing, absolutely nothing we can't achieve.
Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Jennifer. Pat, are you as optimistic as Leader McConnell that they'll avoid a shutdown?
I think so. I think it'd be insane to shut the government down, and I don't think either party wants to do it. Certainly the Republicans don't. And it's one of those things that's so absurd. You know, the Democrats have got to go along. The majority is now held by the Republicans. They have the majority. They have control of the Congress. And the Democrats have got to stop, you know, yakking away in the corner about how bad everything is. They warned about these tax cuts, that they'd be disastrous, and it turns out they've been wonderful. And there's so many bonuses being given by American corporations, it's really terrific. There's one thing, though, that the president is doing that I really want to caution him about, and that has to do with offshore drilling. Apparently, the idea is that they're going to open up all of the corners of the United States to drilling. And, you know, I'm all for drilling, but at the same time, what happened in the Gulf was a disaster. And there weren't adequate safeguards in terms of drilling because there can be explosions, there can be a blowout, and those blowouts can well, you know, they bring millions of barrels of crude oil out into pristine areas. And, you know, like in Virginia Beach, we would just hate to have, you know, a blowout off the coast that would ruin our beaches. And I think the same thing is true in other parts of this country. So I'm all for drill, baby, drill, but at the same time, we've got to be very careful. And if we take away those safeguards that have been put in place, it would be a really unwise thing. That the people doing that drilling in the Gulf didn't have the appropriate blowout protectors on, and as a result, when that thing did hit it did extensive damage. So let's be careful on that one. Well, there's something else happening. There's a fight now between Trump and Bannon, and we'll see what that brings. John?
That's right, Pat. Publishers are speeding up the release of an explosive new book about the first year of Donald Trump's presidency. The controversial book, Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House, is now set to release today. The president was on Twitter last night shooting down the book's credibility, adding that he never spoke to the author. He also tweeted, "I authorize zero access to the White House." The president says the book is full of lies, misrepresentations, and sources that don't exist. And there's new reporting as well that President Trump tried to stop Attorney General Jeff Sessions from recusing himself in the Justice Department's probe into whether some members of the Trump team helped the Russians in interfering in the 2016 election. The New York Times reports Trump took that action while pressure was building up for Sessions to step aside. But the paper says the White House counsel followed Trump's order and lobbied Sessions to remain in charge of the investigation. Well, Palestinians reacted angrily when President Trump threatened to cut off U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority earlier this week. As Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, the face-off puts any future negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians in doubt, as the Senate could take up a measure which would cut back U.S. aid because of a controversial program involving American taxpayer money.
In a pair of tweets, President Trump said, "We pay the Palestinians hundreds of millions of dollars a year and get no appreciation or respect. They don't even want to negotiate a long overdue peace treaty with Israel." He added, "With the Palestinians no longer willing to talk peace, why should we make any of these massive future payments to them?"
I think the president has basically said that he doesn't want to give any additional funding or stop funding until the Palestinians are agreeing to come back to the negotiation table. We're trying to move for a peace process, but if that doesn't happen, the president's not going to continue to fund that situation.
U.S. aid accounts for 40% of the budget for the UN's Relief and Work Agency, better known as UNRWA. It provides millions of dollars to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Many Israeli officials have lobbied the U.S. to stop payment because UNRWA is influenced by Hamas. Some Palestinian officials call the threat blackmail.
I would say that Palestinian rights are not for sale, and we will not succumb to blackmail. There are imperatives and requirements for peace, and unilaterally, President Trump has destroyed them.
The war of words between the Palestinian Authority and President Trump marked one more disagreement after Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and decided to move the U.S. Embassy there. After these latest tweets, Israeli officials had a different take from the Palestinians.
President Trump is absolutely right. It is impossible to wait and wait and wait for so many years for the Palestinians to go forward and renew the negotiation. They left the room in April 14, and for 4 years almost, they are reluctant to negotiate with Israel, and they should not be given so much money from the American taxpayer.
Some of that U.S. taxpayer money goes to a policy dubbed Pay to Slay, where the PA pays convicted terrorists and their families monthly salaries. The U.S. Congress is close to passing the Taylor Force Act, which would cut off Palestinian aid money unless the practice is stopped. Taylor Force was a U.S. citizen who died in Israel during a terrorist attack. A successful vote in the Senate would send the legislation to the president for his signature. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris and Pat. I'm sure you remember it was a month ago today that the House passed the Taylor Force Act.
Well, it should be law immediately. I mean, the idea of paying those Palestinians for killing United Nations soldiers or American soldiers is just outrageous. But there's something that we need to understand. It sounds like United Nations work project, I mean, UNRWA. You think, well, that's a good thing. No, it's not. Ever since that war that took place when Israel took over some of that territory, the Arabs left their homes and they were told by their leaders, you leave here and we will beat these Israelis and then you can come back into your homes and you can live your life and take your property back and so forth. Now, the United Nations set up an organization with United States funding called this Works Agency. And you say, what does it do? Well, what it does is maintain a ghetto environment for these displaced Palestinians. And they said, you know, you are going to get back the property that was taken away from you in '48. We're talking about decades and decades of these people being kept in suspended animation, promised by the United Nations they're going to get their property back, and that's not going to happen because they voluntarily left and they started a war, and the Israelis won the war, and it's over. That particular agency should be defunded and abolished because they have maintained this fiction that the Palestinians are going to get all their property back. And they've talked about the law of return and so forth. And it's just not going to happen. So they've kept these people, many thousands of them, in refugee camps ever since that war. Instead of resettling them throughout the area and whatever, making agreements with the other Arab countries and resettling these Palestinians. So the United Nations is complicit in what amounts to a fraud on the Palestinian people and on the rest of the world. That agency should have been abolished years ago, decades ago. And I hope and pray that now that they've got all this stuff on the table, they'll do away with UNRWA, which is just a disaster. And why should we pay taxpayer dollars to maintain an agency which keeps these people in perpetual bondage, perpetual displaced status, instead of letting them get into their normal lives and get resettled? It's a disaster, and we just keep picking up the tab, signing the check, and sending it to them. Shouldn't happen anymore. Terry?
It seems like a very deliberate disaster.
Well, that one is, I mean, since 1948, we're talking about decades and decades of keeping these Palestinians in a refugee status and paid for by the United Nations. Exactly.